Now that we know what atoms and subatomic particles and elements are, let's take a look at how compounds are formed between different elements. And let's just define a compound first. And I'm going to read this definition for you, and then we're going to go back and take a look at some of the separate components, because just about every word in here has significance. So a compound consists of atoms of two or more different elements, chemically bonded, in specific proportions, and possessing properties different than the elements that make it up. Alright, so a compound, which is what we're defining here, two or more different elements. So if there are two or more atoms that are coming together, but they're the same element, then it's not a compound. It's not considered a compound. It's considered an element. It's elemental. Remember, elements, we can use the term element to refer to just one atom, one kind of atom, or one atom of a specific kind, or more than one atom of a specific kind bonded together, like oxygen, O2. Both atoms are oxygen, therefore it's not a compound. Chemically bonded, which involves electrons, the interaction between electrons between the two atoms. So that's what constitutes or defines a chemical bond. There has to be interaction between electrons between the atoms to bond them together in specific proportions. So if you change the number of the different kinds of atoms in the compound, then you now have a different compound. So different compounds are different because they have different proportions of different elements making them up, and possessing properties different than the elements that make them up. And we'll come back to that idea as we go through these examples here. So that's a compound. Like I just mentioned, molecular oxygen, O2, is not a compound because the two atoms, it is made up of two atoms, or two or more atoms, like it says here in the definition, but they're both the same kind. They're both oxygen. That makes this a molecule of oxygen. It's elemental oxygen. It's only made up of one kind of atom. The composition of compounds is symbolized using what we call a chemical formula. And then the next thing I ask you to do here is write chemical formulas. And I went searching for a little more exciting images of these different chemical formulas. But let's start with carbon dioxide, a simple one. And I chose this image because, we always talk about our carbon footprint. That's kind of what this is getting at. The carbon dioxide that we're producing, putting into the atmosphere, causing climate change, and that's a problem. But CO2, right? One atom of carbon, two atoms of oxygen. In that specific proportion, that's what makes this carbon dioxide, CO2. Water, H2O, right? And that's probably one that you know right off the top of your head. Everybody knows H2O as water, but what that means is two atoms of hydrogen, one atom of oxygen. In that proportion, if you change that proportion, it's no longer water. Hydrochloric acid, HCl. This one gives you an indication, too, of the difference in size of different atoms, because different atoms have different sizes. Chlorine is much larger than hydrogen, and actually what they're showing here is probably not representative of the real size difference between them. The size difference is bigger than this. But that's hydrochloric acid, HCl. One atom of hydrogen, one atom of chlorine, hydrochloric acid. Sulfuric acid, H2SO4, that's battery acid, which is stronger than hydrochloric acid. Sodium chloride, which is table salt. And what I've shown here is what's known as a chemical equation, not to be confused with the chemical formula, right? What we're looking at here are chemical formulas of different compounds. Here is the chemical equation for sodium chloride. Sodium and chlorine come together to make sodium chloride, and that's table salt. Interesting here, and this goes back to the idea that the properties are different between the elements that make them up. Sodium is highly reactive, and so is chlorine. If you put sodium in water, it reacts with the water to the point where it practically explodes. So it's dangerous. If you eat elemental sodium, you're going to die. Chlorine is also highly reactive. If you breathe in chlorine gas, for example, you're going to die. It will react with the water in the lining of your lungs and form hydrochloric acid and kill you. If you take these apart and put them back together into sodium chloride, they're delicious. They're harmless. We sprinkle them all over our French fries and we eat it. So that's probably the best example of how the properties of the compound are much different than the properties of the elements that make them up. Where were we? So that's sodium chloride, and then finally hydrogen peroxide. And this is an example of how when you change the proportions of the atoms, it changes the compound. So H2O is water, right? 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. So there are twice as many hydrogens as oxygen. That's the proportion. In H2O2, hydrogen peroxide, that's hydrogen peroxide, H2O2. The same number of hydrogens as there are oxygens. In other words, the proportions have changed between water to hydrogen peroxide, and that's what makes hydrogen peroxide a different compound. I've also included here the chemical equation for photosynthesis, just to show what a chemical formula looks like. I'm sorry, a chemical equation looks like. And this is a really important chemical equation to know about and understand when it comes to the study of biology. So we've got carbon dioxide and water and light energy splitting those compounds. Both carbon dioxide and water are compounds. We're using light energy to split them apart, rearrange the atoms, put them back together again in chemical bonds to form glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen, which is not a compound, right? That's elemental oxygen. So this is just an example of different compounds and also kind of introducing the idea of chemical equations. So as I mentioned, bonding involves the interaction of electrons. And there are special electrons in atoms that are involved in these interactions. They're called valence electrons. Valence electrons are the electrons, the outermost electrons in an atom. And there are 2 ways that the electrons can interact in order to form a compound. One way is to form an ionic bond, and that's what this slide is all about, is to try to explain that. And I think the best way to do that is to simply go through the points that we're making on this slide in response to the questions. So a neutral sodium atom has 11 electrons. All right, so here we're looking at a sodium atom, a neutral sodium atom, 11 electrons. You'll notice that there are these rings that represent what we refer to as energy levels. And you'll notice that there are 2 electrons in the first energy level of sodium. There are 8 electrons in the second energy level of sodium. And in the third energy level, there's only 1, for a total of 11. A neutral chlorine atom has 17 electrons. So again, 2 in the first energy level, 8 in the second energy level, and then 7 in the outer energy level. And that's also referred to as the valence level. And you can also you'll also see these referred to as shells. So the first energy shell, second energy shell, third energy shell. So the rings and distances are known as energy levels or energy shells, right? The innermost energy level appears to be able to hold about a maximum of 2 electrons, not about, a maximum of 2 electrons. You'll notice that both of these have only 2 electrons in the first energy level. The second and third energy levels appear to hold a maximum of 8 electrons. Now we can't see that in either one of these atoms. The third energy level, the sodium only has 1 and the chlorine only has 7. So we can't really observe that from this, but I'm telling you that they hold a maximum of 8 electrons. That's known as the octet rule, by the way. The octet rule. Octet for 8. The outermost electrons, as I said, are the ones that participate in a chemical bond. They're called valence electrons. Vocabulary term, right? Valence. And they're found in what we can refer to as the valence shell, or the valence energy level. And in the case of both sodium and chlorine, the valence energy level is the third energy level. When the neutral sodium atom loses an electron, its overall charge will be 1. So notice this arrow here in the diagram. It's referring to the transfer, as is labeled, the transfer of that electron. That outer valence electron, that one lone third energy level valence electron in sodium, is going to be, when sodium and chlorine get close together, that electron will be transferred from sodium to chlorine. In other words, chlorine will take it for itself and put it into its outer energy level, making its outer energy level, its valence shell, have 8 electrons. You can think of this as selfish. In other words, the chlorine, just like little kids playing on a playground with a toy, one is selfish and grabs it and takes it for him or herself, right? So that's what's happening here. Chlorine is ripping that electron from sodium. When the neutral chlorine atom gains an electron, its overall charge is going to be -1. So notice what's being transferred here is a negative charge, 1 negative charge. So when sodium, which starts out neutral, loses a negative charge, that leaves behind an extra proton to give the overall atom a positive charge. When that happens, we no longer call it an atom. We call it an ion because it has a positive charge. So this is the symbol for the sodium ion, Na and usually this is a superscript plus, Na plus, right, to show that one positive charge. Chlorine, in receiving that electron, is receiving 1 negative charge. And it was neutral, but then it receives 1 negative charge, and the overall charge on the atom is now negative, right? And so we symbolize that with Cl with a superscript minus, Cl minus. That's the chloride atom. Notice the difference in naming here. Sodium is just becomes the sodium ion. Chlorine becomes the chloride ion. And that naming rule has to do with the fact that it's a negatively charged ion. Negatively charged ions, the name ends in IDE to let you know that it's negatively charged. So that's the chloride ion. Now, this is just the definition of an ion, an atom with an overall charge. That's an ion. So as soon as it has an overall charge, we call it an ion. The oppositely charged sodium and chlorine ions, will be attracted to each other because, as you know, opposites attract, right? Now the sodium is positively charged and the chlorine is negatively charged after the transfer of the electron. The sodium is positively charged, the chloride is negatively charged, and they will be attracted to each other by their opposite charges. Kind of like, you can think of it as kind of like static electricity. You build up a negative charge in a balloon when you rub it on your hair, for example, and you can stick it to the ceiling because it's being attracted to the positively charged molecules making up the ceiling, whatever the ceiling is made up of, drywall usually. That's what we call an ionic bond. So it's just the electrical attraction between opposite charges that holds the ions together. And that's known as an ionic bond. It is a chemical bond, and it's known as an ionic bond. It's the weakest kind of chemical bond. So on the next slide, we'll be looking at covalent bonding, and you'll see that it's a much stronger chemical bond than an ionic bond. And this is also important in when we start looking at aqueous solution chemistry and how easily sodium chloride, for example, will dissolve in water. We call this an ionic compound. So this is an ionic bond, therefore we call this an ionic compound. And it's sodium chloride. Chemical formula being NaCl, just like we saw in the previous slide. There's no such thing as a molecule of an ionic compound. In other words, terminology-wise, we don't refer to this as a molecule. We reserve the term molecule to refer to covalently bonded atoms. Before we go on, I forgot to point out that the reason that chlorine will take an electron from sodium is that it wants to fill its outer valence shell. It wants to have 8 electrons in its outer valence shell. It will feel more stable with 8 electrons in its outer shell. Sodium, on the other hand, doesn't mind losing its 1 electron in its outer energy level or energy shell, because it would also like to have 8 in its outer energy shell. And when it loses that electron, what's left behind, well, the third energy level is now gone, basically. So now that it only has the second energy level, and it is full with 8 electrons. So that's why we call this the octet rule. So chlorine very much wants to have that electron, and sodium doesn't mind giving it up, and that's what makes these two elements very reactive by themselves. Chlorine will try to rip an electron from just about anything, and sodium will try to give its electron to just about anything. So that makes them highly reactive, but when they get together, the chlorine gets the electron and is happy, and the sodium loses the electron and is happy, and they form table salt. So here we're looking at covalent bonding, and it involves the interaction of outer energy electrons, valence electrons, just like in ionic bonding. But like in ionic bonding, you can think of it as selfish. In covalent bonding, you can think of it as sharing, and it's not selfish. And it's a stronger kind of bonding. And so if you consider that there are 2 energy levels here in oxygen, in the oxygen atom, and if you count up the number of electrons in that outer energy level, there are 8. So when oxygen forms water with 2 hydrogen atoms, it's happy with 8 valence electrons. Hydrogen only has 1 energy level, and if you'll recall, the first energy level holds 2 electrons. Hydrogen's happy if it has 2 electrons in its outer energy level. So you'll notice if you look at the overall molecule here of water, everybody's happy. The oxygen has 8 electrons, valence electrons. The hydrogens have 2 valence electrons. And there's sharing going on here. They're sharing electrons. That's what we call a covalent bond. Now, if you think about before binding with hydrogen, there are 6 valence electrons in a neutral oxygen atom. It only has 6. It would like to have 8, but it only has 6. That's what causes it to want to interact with 2 hydrogen atoms. 2 more electrons would fill the oxygen's valence energy level. Before binding with oxygen, there is 1 valence electron in each neutral hydrogen atom. So each hydrogen atom, before bonding with oxygen, only had 1 electron. It would like to have 2. 1 more electron would fill hydrogen's valence energy level, right? That's what it wants to do. That's what would make it feel more stable. So as shown in the figure, oxygen can fill its valence energy level by sharing 1 electron each with 2 hydrogen atoms. By sharing 1 electron each with 2 hydrogen atoms. Sharing. The hydrogen atoms can fill their valence energy level by sharing 1 electron with oxygen. Hydrogen wants 1 more electron to fill its first energy level, and it can do that by sharing an electron with oxygen. Each atom is sharing 2 electrons with another atom, and that's what we call a covalent bond. This is a single covalent bond, which implies that there can be double covalent bonds and triple covalent bonds, and there can. But we'll come back to that idea. Covalent bonds are stronger than ionic bonds because of the sharing that's going on. It locks, you can think of it as locking the atoms together more strongly because they're sharing those electrons. They can't leave because they're being held there by this locking together and sharing of electrons. The chemical formula, of course, is H2O. This would be referred to as a molecular compound. Covalently bonded compounds are molecular compounds. So this is a molecule of water. We can't call the sodium chloride a molecule technically because it's not covalently bonded, it's ionically bonded. But water is a covalently bonded compound, and we can refer to it as a molecular compound. When it involves sharing 4 or 6 electrons, they're referred to as double and triple covalent bonds. So when 2 electrons are being shared between atoms, that's a single covalent bond. If there are 4 electrons being shared, that's a double covalent bond, which is even stronger. And when there are 6 electrons being shared between two atoms, that's a triple covalent bond, which is even stronger. So that's bonding between atoms, ionic and covalent bonding. Here we're looking at attractions between molecules, not between atoms, but between molecules. So once molecules have formed by covalent bonding, they can be attracted to each other also. So just like atoms can be attracted to each other, for example, by the opposite charges attracting an ionic bond, molecules can be attracted to each other by opposite charges attracting also. So there can be an unequal distribution of charge in a molecule. And this unequal distribution of charge can cause molecules to be attracted to each other. And that's what we call a van der Waals force. Van der Waals forces are weak attractions between molecules, not between atoms, but between molecules. So the tokay gecko, for example, if you look under an electron microscope at the bristles on the toe pads of a tokay gecko, you're going to see little hairs, little bristles that are extremely small. The tips of these bristles are microscopic. That's why we're using an electron microscope to see them. They're only a couple microns, like the pad on each bristle here that we can see is just I'm not exactly sure how big they are, but they're extremely tiny. And because of that, and there are billions, millions and billions of these bristles on the bottom of the toes, each tip is interacting with the molecules of whatever the tokay gecko is climbing on. So that allows these kinds of geckos that have these bristles on their toes to cling to smooth surfaces. They can walk on glass, they can walk upside down on the ceiling, they can run up walls, and that's due to van der Waals forces. By themselves, van der Waals forces are weak, but once you put together all these billions of bristles on the bottom of the toes of the gecko, it's surprisingly strong. They did a study, I saw a study done once where they actually tried to measure the force generated that was holding a tokay gecko onto a pane of glass, and they found it to be 2 pounds. It took 2 pounds of force to pull that gecko off the glass. All right, this time I'm not going to read our way through. I'm just going to pull up everything that is on this slide and explain what's going on here. So oxygen is what we call very electronegative. In the water molecule, oxygen is very electronegative. It's able to attract electrons to itself. And that's because it has so many protons, so many more protons in its nucleus than hydrogen does. So protons, as you'll recall, are positively charged and opposites attract. So the protons are kind of sucking the electrons to themselves, pulling the electrons to the oxygen end of the water molecule. And what that results in is that the oxygen end of the molecule is slightly more negative than the hydrogen end of the molecule. That's what we call polarity. So the water molecule is polar. And that's the basis for all the magical properties of water. Water, you may not think of it because we're so used to water being around, and we drink it and we use it for all kinds of different purposes, and it's crucial for life and the evolution of life on this planet, the molecular evolution and the survival of life on this planet. So we take it for granted. But it's a magical compound. And it all comes back to the whole idea that the water molecule is polar. So what I'm trying to stress here is that this concept is fundamental in understanding all the different properties of water. So remember that water is polar. So if we place charges on this atom, on this molecule, like I said, the oxygen end of the molecule is slightly negative compared to the hydrogen end. And I used a separate minus signs or 2 minus signs at the oxygen end and 2 positive signs, at the hydrogen end, to emphasize what we're going to see on the next slide, which is the fact that one water molecule can interact with 4 other water molecules. But it's because it's polar that it's able to do this. So it all starts with polarity. Just like the Earth has a north and south pole, the water molecule has positive and negative poles, right? That's the idea. That's why it's called polarity. So as I mentioned, all the magical properties of water go back to the fact that water is polar. And this is the first property that results from that. And it's the fact, as I mentioned on the previous slide again, that water molecules will interact with other water molecules. And you'll see one water molecule being able to interact with 4 other water molecules by forming these things that we call hydrogen bonds. And hydrogen bonds completely different, even though they call it a bond. It's not a chemical bond because it doesn't involve either the sharing or the selfish transfer of electrons between atoms. This is simply a relatively weak attraction. It's kind of like a van der Waals force. It's a weak attraction between water molecules. Right? So we've seen 2 kinds of chemical bonds, ionic bonds and covalent bonds. That's between atoms. And we've also seen 2 relatively weak forces between molecules, van der Waals force and now hydrogen bonding. And those are weak forces between molecules that results from the uneven distribution of charge in the molecule. So we call this a hydrogen bond because it's involving hydrogen, right? So if you'll recall, the hydrogen end of the water molecule has a slightly positive charge and the oxygen end has a slightly negative charge. And that allows water molecules to interact with each other and form hydrogen bonds. They're kind of stuck to each other. They're kind of sticky because opposite charges attract. I'm just pulling up what it says on this slide. Okay, so in order of weakest to strongest, that was one of the questions that you were asked to respond to. Van der Waals forces are the weakest. And again, to stress here, that's a relatively weak force. It's actually the weakest force between molecules, not between atoms, but between molecules, right? Hydrogen bonds between molecules are the next strongest. Right, we're putting them in order of strength. So van der Waals are the weakest. Hydrogen bonds between molecules are a little bit stronger, but it's still between molecules, right? Ionic bonds are between atoms, forming compounds, right? And they're stronger than these weak attractions between molecules, van der Waals and hydrogen bonds. And then we have covalent bonds, which are the strongest of all. And again, that's between atoms. So 2 relatively weak forces between molecules due to the distribution of charge in the molecule, causing opposites to attract. And we have 2 kinds of chemical bonds between atoms that are forming compounds. Right? So you want to try to keep those 4 different bonding or attractions, I should say, straight. So as we go through all these different properties of water, these magical properties, you always want to think and remember that it goes back to the fact that water is polar and forms hydrogen bonds. So because water molecules are polar and they form hydrogen bonds, that means that water molecules are attracted to each other. And that attraction to each other is known as cohesion. Water molecules tend to stick to each other. They're cohesive. And that leads to a number of different, it creates a number of different environments or environmental variables in different ecosystems. So for example, this water strider is walking on the surface of the water. It's not even getting its feet wet because it has hydrophobic compounds, water-fearing compounds on its feet that repels the water. And the film, there's a surface film on the top of the water produced by the surface tension the sticking and the cohesion of water molecules at the surface. So the water strider is actually walking on the water. It's not walking in the water in any way. It's walking on that surface tension, that surface film. And there are a number of other organisms that take advantage of the surface film too. So, for example, the larvae of mosquitoes will hang themselves upside down from the surface film until they emerge as flying mosquitoes. There are a lot of other organisms, bacteria and algae and so forth, that lives on the surface film on a body of water. Also, the cohesion is the reason that the water forms beads on a hydrophobic surface. So on the surface of this leaf, there's a waxy layer on the leaf called the cuticle that is hydrophobic, and the water beads on that hydrophobic surface, just like the water will bead on the wax of a car when you first wax it, because the wax is hydrophobic. Water is not only cohesive and sticks to itself, it's also adhesive and sticks to other things. So just like it can form hydrogen bonds with itself, it can form hydrogen bonds with other molecules. And that's known as adhesion. Just like tape is adhesive tape, right? It sticks to other things. Water will stick to other things. And it all goes back to the fact that water is polar and will form hydrogen bonds. So, like I said, all these different properties go back to that. You'll notice that in this graduated cylinder, the water is forming a U shape, and that's known as, the water-air interface here is called the meniscus, and the meniscus of water is kind of U-shaped because it's sticking to the glass. It's adhering to the glass. It has adhesive properties, and it sticks to the glass and sags in the middle. And that's a result of the property of adhesion, the fact that water is sticking to the glass. Anything that gets wet is wet because the water is sticking to it. It's kind of the opposite of what we saw on the previous slide. Hydrophobic compounds don't get wet. They repel the water and they don't get wet. Hydrophilic compounds will get wet because they're water-loving. Hydrophilic is water-loving. The next magical property of water is capillarity, or capillary action. And it's the idea that water will move all by itself up through very small tubes, very small diameter tubes, or fine meshwork. So this very small glass tube here is called a capillary tube, and this is blood in the capillary tube. And blood is an aqueous solution. It's both an aqueous solution and a suspension. The blood cells are suspended in it, but there are all kinds of things dissolved in it, and that's what makes it a solution. But it's in water, right? Aqueous refers to water. And so blood will, if you go to the doctor, a doctor may use a capillary tube to take a sample of your blood. And just by touching the very tip of this tube to a drop of blood on your finger, the blood will automatically move up into the tube. It doesn't get pushed up into the tube. It doesn't get sucked up into the tube. There's no real force moving the blood into the tube. It just moves up into the tube all by itself. And that's an example of capillary action or capillarity. Plants use this to their advantage. So if it wasn't for capillary action, plants wouldn't be able to move the aqueous solution from the soil up through their roots and through their stems and out into their leaves, high off the ground. They do this through their vascular tissue, and their vascular tissue is made up of very fine tubes, just like this capillary tube. So capillary action is necessary for plants to be able to move water through their vascular tissue and up high off the ground into their stems and leaves. This property emerges. It's an emergent property, just like all the properties of water are emergent properties from the fact that it's polar and forms hydrogen bonds. This property of capillarity emerges from the fact that water is both cohesive and adhesive. So the water is adhering, like in the capillary tube here, the water is adhering to the glass of the tube, and as the water molecules stick to the glass of the tube, they're also pulling water molecules behind them. They're cohesive to the water molecules behind them, and pulling the water molecules behind them as they move up into the tube, as they stick to the inside of the tube. So both those properties together are what lead to capillary action, or give water the property of capillarity. We have more magical properties of water to go. Believe it or not, water is magic.